Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Erin Page. I'm the Senior Law Librarian on staff with Fast Case Legal Research. And with me is Morgan Wright. Morgan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Morgan Morissette Wright. I'm the publisher at our in-house imprint, Full Court Press. We've released a number of books over the last few years, the newest of which is Mr. O'Reilly's book on vaccine risks, benefits, and compensation. And we're really excited to have him in this program today. And I think it'll be a great conversation. And also we'll have the opportunity to have some audience participation as well.
Fantastic. So just a couple of quick housekeeping announcements, and then we'll join our wonderful guest speaker today. Our first announcement, you may have noticed that you're currently in listen-only mode. That's to ensure that there isn't a ton of background noise so everyone can hear our wonderful speaker. However, questions are welcome at any point during today's presentation. To ask questions, on your screen, you should still have the pop-up from GoToWebinar. On that, there is a button labeled Questions, and if you enter your question there, we can see it, we can ask it at the appropriate time during the presentation, etc. So please ask any questions that you might have. We'd love to have them as part of our presentation. Our second announcement and reminder, today's session is not for CLE credit. Fastcase does offer CLE webinars, which you can sign up for by going to fastcase.com/webinars. However, we do not offer CLE credit for today's session, but it is going to be a fantastic session with a lot of information, a lot of great questions and focus. So we're super happy to have you join us. And with that, I'll go ahead and bring our guest in. Mr. O'Reilly is our wonderful speaker for today. And just a little bit of background information on Professor O'Reilly. He is an expert in the field of public health policy and in food and drug safety laws, has written a number of publications as well as being involved in a number of projects and commissions involving the FDA, Center for Disease Control, Consumer Product Safety Commission, just a real expert in the field and a real wonderful person to have join us for today's presentation. I could go on listing his accomplishments, but then we'd use up most of our time and you wouldn't have a chance to hear him speak to the topic. So I'll go ahead and just start this session by turning it over to Mr. O'Reilly, letting him introduce himself a little bit further.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you, Morgan. It's hard to say what an expert should know in any given field because there's such a spread, such a plethora of opinions and pieces of knowledge. Vaccines are no different. You can find a large amount of information by studying the scientific literature, as I have. You can find some useful information in some of the medical literature, but you can't find much in the legal literature, and that poses the question, who should I turn to get useful information? For me, the high point of my 40-some year career came at 9:15 a.m. on Monday, March 23rd, 2000, when the phone rang and the person at the other end said, Professor, this is John Doe from the Washington Post. What do you think of the United States Supreme Court calling you the expert on medical products? And I laughed. I laughed into the phone. I said, sure. When's that going to happen, buddy? 15 minutes ago. Wow, well, thank you. I certainly agree. And I went online and the Supreme Court said, the experts have written that. Then they cut a chunk of my textbook dealing with FDA regulation. Wow, that was really cool from the point of view of the author. Because if you're an author, you've gone through all the vagaries of acceptance or rejection, details and the like. And so when the Supreme Court calls you the expert, it feels very good. Today, I'm not going to claim that the Supreme Court has called me the expert on vaccines. But by the end of this talk, I'd like you to become expert enough to understand when the case brought to you by the potential client is really worth your attention, whether it's not. We're looking at it as lawyers rather than as physicians. We're not strictly speaking in the public health sense, but we're speaking about how does the public health intersect with the legal system. So our topic today, vaccine risks, benefits, compensation, involves the legal organizations, law firms, and individual lawyers, intersecting with government, intersecting with the manufacturers of vaccines, the delivery points of vaccines, such as hospitals and clinics and physicians, and the potential that something might go wrong. And if something goes wrong, what would the compensation be? How would it be managed? In front of a large class of students, I try to say, think about compensation from the point of view of the client you're trying to help. Will you be able to get them the money that they will need for their medical bills, for their living expenses, for remedial steps, such as building a ramp into the house if they must live the rest of their lives in a wheelchair? What does compensation have to do with the risks and benefits of the vaccine? I'm going to approach it today on the assumption that you know a little bit about the legal system for compensation of torts. Compensation is a broad category, of course, but when it intersects with vaccine risks and benefits, there's some very defined limitations. I'd like you to think about those. So when I set out to write this book on vaccine risks and benefits and compensation, I started from the background of one who's written 56 earlier books, and the 3-volume, soon to be 4-volume textbook on food and drug regulation has been my mainstay. Since 1976, when my first book came out, since 1979, when my FDA treatise, I've been engaged in presentations, programs, web programs, TV, C-SPAN, and the like. Been talking to a lot of people about the system of regulation, the system of compensation. So that forms the reference point from which we'll be talking today with a series of questions about vaccine risk, benefits, and compensation. But I emphasize, this is not the end all. You'll need to read up more about it. Hopefully you'll read from this book, but you'll need to read and study more before you can say to the client, you have no case, or you have a wonderful case, and I'm expecting to win $1 million. So today is one step in your putting into perspective the request of your clients for some forms of response or compensation. That's what we'll be doing. So Aaron's looked at the book, and others have looked at the book, and I've gotten very good feedback. Quite often people have said, wow, I never knew that. Hopefully you'll get enough out of today, and hopefully you get enough out of the textbook itself to be able to respond efficiently, effectively, factually, when the client comes in and says, I think getting this vaccine harmed me in some way. So we're going to begin now with some questions. I'd like Aaron and Morgan to think about what's the best way I can be helpful to the audience.
Thanks so much for that introduction. Starting at the beginning, we know you're not yourself a vaccine researcher or something of that nature, but can you tell us a little bit very briefly about the stages a vaccine goes through when they're testing for safety, et cetera?
A group of physicians and a group of biochemists will typically get together and recognize that the disease to which they are opposing, that disease has a weak point somewhere. It may be a biochemical weak point, it may be a medical, physiological, but it's a point that they need to demonstrate. They need to demonstrate how it works how it infects the body, how it harms the body. What's the best way to block that, to fight against that risk? What's the benefit to the patient getting the injection of the vaccine? So the group gets together, decides whether they're going to use an adenovirus as a basis, whether they're going to use messenger RNA, as it's called, riboflavin. Getting into RBA, messenger RBA, you do definitely need a PhD, and I don't have one. But messenger RNA or adenoviruses are two of the types of materials you start. When you're starting, you then develop a tool set to measure effectiveness first in the test tube, then in the rats or other animals, then in the very early stages of human exposure. And then what would it take to demonstrate to a larger population of people that this is going to work? Your core group then typically would be no more than 12 science-trained, doctoral level people coordinating from multiple countries, perhaps, how we're going to get to the solution to this new virus or this new infection. What we're going to do. That's how you would start. From there, it branches off, of course, into many different subsets, but that's the starting point. Erin?
Excellent starting point. So you've talked about, or we just talked a bit about the starting point of the virus process. Let's talk a little bit about some of the risks involved with a vaccine. Some of them are going to be risks involved with the shot process. Some of them are going to be risks involved with various comorbidities that are involved with the treatment. But can you tell us a little bit from a legal perspective about these medical complications or comorbidities?
We as lawyers are approached by people who want to be given compensation for their injuries. Compensation they seek addresses, for example, the pain and suffering that they have, or the retrofitting of their vehicles or their homes, deal with their lack of mobility. All of those factors vary in the product's liability world, and they vary tremendously from state to state and from negligence or practice or strict liability with a variety of theories. We begin with the concern that you actually want to help that client, you actually want to benefit. The reason you're holding out your shingle, as it were, for people is to say, I am an attorney and I can help you. Part of what we're doing today is to discuss how should you respond to that, and in light of the concerns that vaccines may pose some adverse reactions, what should you do and how should you respond? That's the benefit that we're looking for. What's the benefit to that client? What can I do for that client? Should I get some form of compensation for that client? I would also like to have my expenses covered and my costs covered. Make a little bit of money on the side, as lawyers do. If the patient has had the vaccine, it has not worked, why didn't it work? If the vaccine has posed a more serious physical problem, what was that problem? How did it come about? That's how we approach this situation. Think of it in terms of being a responsive, service-oriented professional, advising that person. Erin?
So moving on from the client side of things, can you speak a little bit to the logistical difficulties in transporting and preserving the COVID-19 vaccines? Because I think we all know from the news, the vaccines have to be kept at a certain temperature, et cetera. So is there a possibility for liability due to those transportation issues if a batch becomes too heated or something and is still given out, still administered to certain people?
It's going to vary tremendously as to what temperature this group of vials kept in. What were the vials kept in? At what degrees? And at the time that they were being inoculated to persons, immunizations, what was the preservation? All these variables will perhaps be significant, but most likely there will be a standard delivery, standard storage, standard removal, a standard injection, if you will, into the vial, from the vials, into the needle, from the needle into the patient. Pretty much standard. It will be a rare event if a well-managed health center varied greatly, or heated up, or allowed to melt, if you will, the aspects of the vaccine that are so specifically preserved. They're to be specifically preserved no warmer than X. The health center, therefore, stays with refrigeration equipment, stays with that refrigeration equipment, keep that number, temperature, above the level that would be a concern. It documents that by printouts and other means of administration. The goal then is not to have the vehicle or the tent or the ballroom, whatever it's being used, not to have that facility span the heat problem that was recognized at the factory. At the factory, they recognized they needed to keep it at a certain level. They needed to pack it in a certain type of material. They needed to ship it. They've chosen at the factory, put on the label, must be kept above X degrees or below X degrees. And the obligation the recipient is to maintain it at that level. There are rare newspaper stories, news media coverages, when there's a facility that just doesn't, and gets complaints. Those are very rare. Think about it in terms of how we benefit the patient by preserving the product at the right level, the right temperature. So it's exactly what the person should be receiving in their injection. Right?
Excellent. So moving from the transportation and the preservation of the COVID-19 vaccine, let's actually talk about some of the regulations that has permitted the vaccine in the first place. Specifically, there's been a lot of controversy regarding the emergency use authorization. Do you have any specific best practices or limitations that you would recommend regarding these emergency use authorizations? Or to put it another way, can you tell us a little bit about the fine line that's involved with these emergency use authorizations between informed consent and failure to warn?
If we could look behind the curtain and see the people inside the Food and Drug Administration, many of the more senior people have been trained on the system since 1962 for the full new drug application, phases of that full new drug application, resulting in an approved new drug application, NDA. Those since 1962 have been literally the gold standard around the world for the winning of product approval in the pharmaceutical field. Winning your NDA can be worth millions in your ability to sell your company or sell that product line or sell that individual product. It can be worth millions. But the new drug application takes years. So Congress gave the FDA several years ago specific authority to do something unusual. An emergency could be met with authorization for the use of a product which did not have full Food and Drug Administration approval. I'll say that again. FDA could give this product a new drug application, could give it full approval, but it's not going to take 6 months, 7 months, 8 months. It's going to take years. So the company that wants the emergency use is going to have to show the same people at FDA, instead of taking your normal path, it takes years. We want to treat this as an emergency because in the case of COVID-19, we want to go beyond that cause, that concern, and we want to get the product out there on an emergency basis with your authorization. We sponsor the drug seeking the emergency use authorization. We recognize we don't get the full shield of having gotten the FDA's new drug approval, but we get an emergency permission for it to come on the market. Easy come, easy go. It can be pulled off the market without a hearing if the FDA determines the emergency, or more likely, that the use authorization for this product isn't a good fit for the particular emergency. So when we think about it, we're going to say it. We've got a quickie approach and a long-term approach. If you want the long-term approach, while you are doing the quickie, the emergency use authorization, you're simultaneously gathering data, getting results from tests, getting further trials, getting feedback from complaints and the like. You're putting it together in a package. You're asking the FDA, now give us our full new drug approval. Those two systems, emergency use can be withdrawn quickly. New drug applications, much longer and more complex. There are values to having both, but we don't as a society. We don't want people to die waiting 5 or 6 years for all the regulatory T's to be crossed and I's to be dotted. Instead, we're going to have an emergency escape valve. And that's what Congress did, authorizes the emergency. Karen?
Thank you for that detailed explanation. Moving on to another topic yet again, in the book you talk a bit about failed vaccines. Can you explain what the elements are of a failed vaccine, and what does that say about the pitfalls to avoid with future vaccine investigation and use?
Don't get on Jim. Jim was the name of a horse. The horse was being used to pull wagons in St. Louis, Missouri. An epidemic arose in St. Louis in 1902, and they thought the best way to prevent that cholera from spreading was to develop an immediate vaccine. So they took the horse named Jim, injected him with a live cholera virus, on the expectation that what came out of Jim and was drawn out could then be injected into humans. It didn't quite work that way because Jim had other problems, not simply his exposure to cholera. And from that horse named Jim, many people died in Louis. That was not a good experience for the people of St. Louis, not a good experimentation, and it set a milestone saying, don't rush too much on the safety testing, because there may be a serious negative consequence. What was concerning then, as is concerning now, is do we have the right model? Do we have the right way of determining that this works? Have we figured out the best way to break down the coronavirus known as COVID-19? Break it down and close it. If we do that methodically, then the emergency use application is appropriate. The emergency use application is a significant concern for the makers of the product because they want to get on the market now. But they don't want to be in this situation. They rush it onto the market. They've made a basic error in the production, manufacturing, isolation, purification, any of the other processes. They don't want to spoil it. So here we are looking at it from the point of view of the person who is going to get the injection. She or he wants that product to be made as pure as possible and as close as possible to the targeted objective. This will prevent you from having the coronavirus spread. No guarantee, of course, it will always, but this is the purest form of this particular material which we can manufacture, deliver, and inject. That's the approach. Erin?
That is funny. Sorry, I'm still giggling over here. Don't get on Jim. So new question or a new area. COVID-19 is officially in the Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program. And that's one of the programs that you mentioned where it can be very difficult to achieve a compensation or to have compensation issued for a particular situation. Tell us about this CICP program and the impact it has on vaccine-related claims.
Okay. I agree with Joe Biden on some things. We disagree on others. When Senator Biden was the ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and the Senate was getting down to the very final days in November of 2005, it was about to end that legislative year. Instead of going for hearings through the Senate Judiciary Committee, the lobbyists for the major pharmaceutical companies pushed through, in addition to the Defense Appropriations Bill, the bill that had to pass, and they pushed it through at the end of 2005 without those hearings, which Senator Biden complained about, saying, we haven't heard this in my committee. Why is this so urgent? Lobbyists got what they wanted. In the pandemic protections that they received, PrEP Act as it's called, in 2005, they built upon a lower wall. We use the analogy of a little fence and then a big stone wall, such as you'd see in Europe. The stone fence was built in the 1980s and passed by Congress after a full debate in 1986. That gave protection for many of the products which would be given to children today, such as measles, mumps, and rubella injections, routine things. There'd be a compensation system for them. And that compensation system would be handled by the Department of Health and Human Services. That was not sufficient for the lobbyists for the pharmaceutical companies to get the absolute protection that they wanted. So at this very end of 2005, in the Senate, you could go read the congressional record if you wish, the language that they put in bars compensation lawsuits and compensation proceedings with very, very narrow exceptions. If you travel to Europe and you look at some of the old castles, you see in the wall of the castle a very narrow strip, a little window. It can't be marched through, you can't run through it, but you can shoot an arrow out at the people that are attacking the castle. That's the analogy I use here, because the protection that was purchased by the lobbyists, if you will, at the end of 2005, creates a system called the CICP, Countermeasures, Immunization, I'm drawing a blank at the moment, but countermeasures is what they wanted. Once there was a determination that there was a need for a countermeasure, that would be published in the Federal Register. When it was published in the Federal Register, it made it necessary for anyone who was receiving countermeasures vaccine take that risk. She or he would otherwise have been paid for. In the 1986 National, I'm going to try to get this right, National Vaccine Compensation Program. National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. I'm sorry, these are difficult acronyms. What we had then in 1986, children who got the polio vaccine and had a very severe bad reaction come to the government and ask for compensation. People who got the coronavirus didn't stop and read the March 17th, 2020 Federal Register. What the March 17th, 2020 Federal Register says, the government, is announcing a countermeasures. Countermeasures would be a provision that gave legal protection to the manufacturers of the COVID-19 vaccines. So the manufacturers of the COVID vaccines got the equivalent of that stone castle with a very narrow spot for the arrows to fly out. It is very, very difficult to win in the countermeasures injury compensation program, or CICP. It's very difficult to win. So you may be able to say, I think this person got a bad batch. You might say, this should not have been permitted to be sold as a countermeasure. But you lose. You lose because the CICP language in 2005 law breaks up the exit. It breaks up the countermeasures category into a wall against the desires of the plaintiffs. Plaintiffs can't win. Now, plaintiff in a child vaccine case, the tuberculosis vaccine or some other vaccine, that childhood or adult vaccine could be compensated through an administrative process managed by special masters who are sort of like judges, not quite judges, special masters in the U.S. Court of Federal Claims. The system for compensating has been relatively fair since 1986, relatively fair in giving compensation. The CICP is rare, 2005 system. It's rare, blocked, and it's stitched around with language which prevents court review and prevents you from getting to the courts with your objections. As a longtime professor of law, I have never seen such a blanket rejection of compensation as I saw here. This CICP is virtually impregnable is the wrong word, but they're trying to prevent you from getting compensation. So why does that matter? Because if the person coming to you for compensation says, Ms. Attorney, Mr. Attorney, I was injured when I got my COVID shot, you should say to them, I will certainly consider the facts in your case, but I must warn you that COVID has been declared in the March 17, 2020 congressional record to be a countermeasure. And as a countermeasure, it's shielded from most recovery. The CICP system absolutely bars most tort-like injury compensation and practically bars all of the other kinds. So the result is, don't bet that you're going to get any compensation at all. If you can, you need to follow the specifics in our textbook. You need to dig in. Again, I'm telling the textbook. You need to get into it and ask yourself specifically, what is it we can get? Compensation for this injury. It's beyond your normal mechanism of giving clients advice about the tort system in your state, beyond your ability to understand National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, 1986. It is very difficult and very isolated. Again, with my image of the castle with a very thin portal. But in our book, we talk about these complex questions, how you get into it, what you would do, how you'd approach CICP, and simultaneously, while you're asking CICP, that is the government agency for dealing with COVID, you're asking the compensation people for compensation. At the same time, you're telling the truth to your client. Truth is, I can't help you in all of these cases. COVID is such a difficult disease. I'm very proud of my co-author, Janet Aberrath. Janet is an excellent court lawyer. Janet works for a large law firm based in Denver. Berg Simpson firm has done wonderful work. But you'll notice the book is dedicated to her late husband. Because Terry Aberrath, her husband, died of COVID while we were writing this book. It's scary to think all the millions of people around the world who died of COVID and what they could have done had it been perhaps found faster, had we dealt with it faster. You as lawyers are not going to face that, hopefully. You as lawyers will find clients who come in and say, there's a bad side effect, there's a bad consequence, I want to be compensated. When that approach comes, please take out this book, do your homework, and explain to the customer, explain to the potential client what the downsides are and what the challenges are. That's what you have to do. Erin?
You also have a section in the book about future problems, where you talk specifically about the problem of compelled vaccination in the workplace, which we all know has been a hotly debated topic recently. Can you give a little bit of an update on any recent events that have happened that maybe you weren't able to get to before the book was published because they hadn't happened yet, and especially considering the upcoming January deadlines for President Biden's order?
In my spare time as a law professor, I wrote and detailed extensively about workplace safety. I am the general editor of the National Safety Council's Accident Prevention Manual. What we find in the National Safety Council's work, the work of other health and safety people in the workplace, is we need to have protection of those workers from other workers if the other workers are going to carry in the source of the infection. Many years ago, there was a restaurant, big convention center inside a hotel in Philadelphia. The American Legion had its convention there. People went to that hotel, stayed there, and died of a mysterious disease. What was this disease? The answer is the people who came to that convention were breathing from that ventilation system of that hotel. They were breathing what the Bellevue Stratford machine was pumping out. It had an infectious material. Bacterial infection spread beyond the Bellevue Stratford to the people who died of it when they got home. Only through very clinical evaluation did they find the problem was in the breathing. The problem was in the air system and the airflow. Similarly, in early 2020 and the end of 2019, the people of Wuhan, China, began to notice these deaths. What we find then is, looking back at it historically, we've got to be able to discern what was the cause, that led to this terrible effect? What could have been done differently? What could have protected people better? Not only in Wuhan, China, but also in all the communities this came. I don't know if there's any one solution now, but I know as I've been gathering and gathering and gathering for the new edition of our book in the future, there's going to be a lot more information, a lot more consequences. You will be part of the solution. Clients come to you and say, we've had these terrible side effects. What can you do? Part of your answer might be, as I've been a labor arbitrator for years, part of the answer might be, what does the union say? What is the protection that workers have against other workers? Can you have the ventilation system clean? Can you require workers to wear masks? Can you require workers to take the protective vaccine? It's an enormously complex intersection of all these pieces together. Your job, of course, is to advise that particular person about his or her family member who died. Where did they work? What were they exposed to? What did other workers do? What was their process? Now, I could get for hours and hours into the OSHA occupational safety and health, but I won't bother you today. I'll just say, look at the risks and benefits. Look at what the government has chosen to do to reduce the spread of infection. Then make the political choice. Do I want to have this party doing this, that party doing that? Don't have any particular party or solution in mind, but think about requirements for safety as an important part of our entire workplace protection. When it gets down to injections of vaccines, when it gets down to masks, when it gets down to ventilation changes, then we can get into the details. But there's no simple or easy decision, no simple or easy. Right?
I know we're running low on time, so I'll go ahead and combine or ask you to just elaborate a little bit further on that last part of your answer and just ask, what overall advice would you have for practitioners in this very specialized field? Is there something they should do beyond looking at the facts of that particular individual's case? Is there any pitfalls to be aware of? Any specialty education that you would recommend a practitioner have? Anything like that?
I would advise you to think about, what does the court system do with cases of employees against employers? What will the court system do if the individual comes in and says, my employer exposed me to this fatal disease and I barely recovered, but I want compensation? The employer's response would be, we are not in the business of marketing COVID-19 viral particles. They may be incidentally present. We as an employer don't have an obligation to force our employees to deal with health concerns that are bigger than our particular line. That's what we get.
Excellent answer. Well, as I mentioned, we have run to the end of our time availability today. So I'm going to go ahead and encourage the audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them now, or if the perfect question occurs to you 5 minutes after we're done today, you can always ask us direct at support, that's SUPPORT, at fastcase.com. Morgan, do you have any final closing thoughts?
I just want to thank Mr. O'Reilly so much for his time today and all of the detailed and thorough information that was given out to our audience. I know they appreciate it. And I know folks that'll be watching the recording later for months and maybe years to come will appreciate the insights that you've given today. And I also want to encourage everyone to purchase the book if you found this topic and this conversation interesting. And you can do that at fastcase.com/store. Aaron, I don't know if we have a slide for it in the slideshow. But if you have any questions about purchasing the book, you can also send them to support@fastcase.com. The book's available in digital formats that you can download, and it's also available in the fast-paced legal research program, and of course, as always, as a print book as well, if you prefer print, like many of us still do. So with that, I just want to thank everyone for attending. I haven't seen any questions come in the 5 minutes we've been wrapping up here. But thank you again for your time, Mr. O'Reilly. It's been so valuable for our participants, and it's been lovely working with you on this book, and I hope we can sell many more as a result of your help with this program.
Thank you, Morgan. Thank you, Erin. Thank you for all you watching. Appreciate your time.
Have a nice afternoon, everyone.
Yes, have a great one.